take seats. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Bruchim habayim. My name is Yossi Klein Halevi, and I'm a fellow here at the Institute. You're going to be learning David Hartman's Torah over the next week, but tonight is an opportunity for those of us who knew him, who loved him, who were his students and disciples, to speak about the David Hartman that we knew and the David Hartman that profoundly affected our lives and transformed our way of thinking. Before I introduce our wonderful panel, I'd like to share some impressions with you. I had known David, of course, as a thinker, also as a teacher. I had studied with him as an undergraduate on my junior year abroad at Hebrew University in 1973, shortly after David had moved to Israel. But it wasn't until around 2001, 2002 that we became friends and that I became his student. And what triggered that relationship was an article that I'd written about the collapse of the Oslo peace process and the emergence of what I'd called then a new Israeli center that accepted the arguments of the Israeli left about the occupation, but at the same time accepted the arguments of the Israeli right about the untenability of making peace with a national Palestinian movement that rejected our legitimacy. And I get a call from David, and he said, we have to talk. So we got together, and practically the first words I heard from him was, I was wrong. And to those of you who know David, I was wrong. He practically roared it. And that was the beginning of hearing many times over the course of the next 12 or 13 years from David, I was wrong. And what was so moving to me initially in that first encounter was that here was Rabbi David Hartman, who had been anointed by Tom Friedman as the sage of Jerusalem precisely because he represented the left wing, political left wing within Orthodox Judaism. And here was David repudiating a key position with which he had been publicly identified. And that, as I say, became a pattern, not only in David's political thinking, but more profoundly in his theological, his philosophical thinking. David not only fought with everyone, he fought most of all with himself. One of the books that I love most of his is really the last important book that he wrote called The God Who Hates Lies. I urge all of you to get it while you're here, if you haven't read it. And what David does in The God Who Hates Lies is essentially project his own being, his soul, onto God, what he imagines his God to be. And that is a God who, like David Hartman, cannot abide hypocrisy. And if you're wrong, own up to it. And what David did in The God Who Hates Lies is take issue with the David Hartman that I first met when he was a professor at Hebrew University, and the course that he taught was about Soloveitchik's Lonely Man of Faith. And in this book, 40 years later, David Hartman the elder repudiates David Hartman the younger. Now, he had built his career in large part on his work on both the Rambam, Maimonides, and on Rabbi Soloveitchik. And here he was in this book accusing Rabbi Soloveitchik of essentially freezing modern orthodoxy, destroying the soul of modern orthodoxy, by placing the halachic system over individual conscience. I heard David in this room about 1.5 years ago, it was one of the last public talks he gave, speak about the Rambam, again, the other seminal part of his work, and essentially repudiate the Rambam as well. And what he said was, the Rambam is cold. He's cold. And he said, give me Yehuda Halevi. Now, for those of you who have studied or read David, you will know that is David Hartman heresy. Yehuda Halevi was the bad guy of Jewish philosophy. And what he said at that moment was, Yehuda Halevi, at least he's warm. He craves the presence of God. And that was David Hartman the elder, telling David Hartman the younger, not so fast with your judgments. And it was an extraordinary moment. He also said at that talk, he said, I know that when I finish here, you're all going to go home and you're going to ask yourselves, but is he still frum? Is he still religious? Is he still orthodox? And for me, David was one of the most religious people that I knew, a deep craving for God's presence. And our friendship developed in that direction as well. Once we got over the politics, we got to the real issues. And David was fascinated by the Jewish meditation practices that I've been doing. And he asked me at one point, so you really think that you can experience God in your life? And I wanted to say to him, and you really think you can't? And there was this sense in David of a profoundly restless soul, a soul that never stopped asking the big questions, and most of all of himself. He never stopped challenging, pressing himself. David Hartman, the rationalist, was really David Hartman, the mystic. The last time that I saw David was a few weeks before his death. And I went to see him, and Daniel briefed me before the visit, and he said, look, whether or not he seems to be listening, just sit with him and talk. So I talked, and David appeared to be sleeping through most of the visit. And I thanked him. I just wanted to thank him for creating this space in which so many of us could grow and struggle. And I spoke for maybe 15 minutes and then got up to leave, and he was sleeping. And suddenly he wakes up, and I see him struggling with his walker to get to his feet. And he stands up after great effort, and he starts walking with me. And I said, David, are you walking me to the door? And he couldn't speak, he nodded. And it took us, 5 minutes to get to the door. And that was the final and lasting Torah that I learned from David Hartman. So, let me introduce my panelists, and colleagues, and friends. Rabbi Lauren Berkun to our left, my left, directs the Hartman North America's rabbinic and synagogue programs, is a graduate of Princeton, ordained at JTS, a former Wexner Fellow, a former Knohl rabbinic intern, a former RLI member of the Rabbinic Leadership Institute here, initiative from Hartman. She lives in Aventura, Florida, with her husband, Rabbi Jonathan Berkun, and their 3 children. And most of all, she teaches Jewish meditation, and she is a Shivananda yoga instructor. Bernie Steinberg, Vice President of Hartman North America, in charge of the West Coast for Hartman, former President and Director of Harvard Hillel, taught at the Harvard Kennedy School, a founding fellow of the Hartman Institute, one of the, as we say, the Tanaim, one of the Talmudic founders here of the Institute, one of the first fellows, doctorate in Jewish philosophy from the Hebrew University, and a beloved friend. And finally, Yisrael Knohl, who is one of this generation's leading biblical scholars, senior research fellow here at the Machon, and Yecheskel Kaufman Professor of Bible at Hebrew University. Served as visiting professor at the University of California in Berkeley, at Stanford, and at the University of Chicago Divinity School. Author of numerous books and publications, his most recent book from 2009, published jointly by Hartman and Continuum, is titled Messiahs and Resurrection in the Gabriel Revelation. So, Lauren, bevakasha.
Thank you. So the question tonight for our panel was how David Hartman changed my life. And in many ways, that's a very difficult question for me to answer in 10 minutes. It's almost like asking me how Judaism changed my life. Because in many ways, I was really shaped as a Jew, certainly shaped as a rabbi and a teacher of Torah in these walls more than in any other place. And I came to the Hartman Institute at a crucial time in my Jewish journey, having grown up in a secular home and eventually yearning to live a life of Jewish tradition, but being a modern person and a critical thinker, searching for a model of Judaism that would resonate with me. And in 1998, I was already in graduate school, and I was studying here in Jerusalem, and I read David Hartman's A Living Covenant. And for the first time, I read an articulation of Judaism that deeply spoke to me as a critical thinker. It taught me that you can be a critical thinker and a traditional Jew, and not only can you be, but you must be a critical thinker to be a true inheritor of the rabbinic tradition. And I was very blessed to not only have found a thinker, a philosopher who spoke to my soul, but to live in an age when he was here and teaching, and to have almost 10 years to sit in this Beit Midrash in classes with David Hartman as a student in the rabbinic programs, both in the seminars and eventually in an intensive 3-year rabbinic fellowship program. And I just wanted to share 3 ways, there are many more than 3, but 3 main ways that David Hartman and his Torah shaped my life. The first is that I think David Hartman had a talent for making people feel both big and small. And I'll start with how David Hartman made people feel big. David was very interested in his writings and in his philosophy and in what he called religious anthropology. What is the type of human being that is created by living a religious Jewish life? And for David, the type of human being shaped and cultivated by a Jewish religious life is a bold, assertive, aggressive, dignified human being, not a weak or submissive or frail human being the way many critics of religion would claim. But he articulated, especially in A Living Covenant, but throughout all of his teachings and in all of his classes, the idea that to be a Jew, and the rabbinic tradition taught us that to be a Jew means that we can stand as a dignified, autonomous, creative human being, and that God is really the source of empowerment, calling humans to responsibility. And he, in the way that he taught, was a person who was larger than life. He taught us to be bold and assertive also in the way that he acted. And if you came into his class, he was a roaring presence, and he often yelled, either with anger or with joy, but always a loud, large presence. And he also helped people feel big because he wasn't a person who cared about status or hierarchy. It didn't matter if you were a 70-year-old rabbi or a 20-year-old student. He cared about ideas, and he wanted to hear ideas from every kind of human being, from every kind of Jew, and he opened his Beit Midrash to Jews from all denominations and to non-Jews of all religions and philosophies. And the reason people call him David, I call him David, people that were very close and had a personal relationship with him called him Dubi or David. No one called him Rabbi Hartman, and sometimes it feels strange to refer to him as David because he was certainly my Rebbe, my Rav, my rabbi, but he didn't stand on ceremony. Everyone was big. Every human being was empowered with great dignity and value and worth. But at the same time, he had a talent for making people feel small. And first I would say that he made me feel small in part because he was a terrifying teacher. It was frightening to be in his class. He wasn't one of those teachers who would say, oh, any question is a good question. No. If you didn't ask an insightful question which touched on issues of ultimate concern, he was frustrated, he had no patience. And being a somewhat timid person, I can probably count on one hand the number of times I had the courage to ask a question in the 10 years that I studied in his class. But he also made me feel small in a deeply meaningful and a spiritual way. While he focused in his theology and his religious anthropology on the notion of human power and dignity, he also argued that the highest form of aspiration is a perpetual sense of inadequacy, that part of being in the covenant with God and his notion of the covenant was that God accepts us as limited human beings. He talked a lot about human finitude, human creatureliness. We are limited human beings. We are not God. And because we are limited and we are finite, we have to also be humble. And he had a deep theology of religious humility, which was the foundation for his theology of pluralism, that no one human being could have a monopoly on the truth. No one human being can possibly access all of God's Torah, and that we have to be open to learning from everyone. And we have to know that our opinions are not the only right opinion. There's no one ultimate truth. And he modeled that humility in the way that he taught, in the way that he was willing to change his mind, in the way that he was always willing to see multiple perspectives and to share texts from across the Jewish spectrum. So he helped me feel both big and small. David also shaped my life in the way I think about my relationship with God. He spoke very beautifully about God as a source of human empowerment. And the way that he spoke about God became very much the way that I understood my own relationship with God, that God is not there to solve our problems, but God is there as a call to responsibility. And he shared a text that was very central to his teaching that he taught almost every year that I studied here. It had a deep impact on my theology. It's a text from the Talmud, and it questions, why doesn't God solve the evil in the world? Why doesn't God come in and eliminate violence, eliminate crime, eliminate evil? And the Talmud answers, Olam kamin hagonoheg, because the world pursues its natural course, that God doesn't micromanage. God's not going to step into the world and solve our problems. We have to learn how to live with the arbitrary nature of life. And while we may not be able to understand the nature of God and why God allows evil to exist, we can learn how to live in the world, as humans, how to live in a relationship with God. And that released me very much from the need to understand metaphysically the inner workings of God and to focus instead on how, as a human being, I can live in the world and build a relationship with God. He spoke a lot. He used several metaphors for God, but the metaphor that touched me the most was the metaphor of a marriage. And he spoke often about the way in which in the intimacy of marriage, which is a form of a covenant, you don't expect your spouse to solve all your problems. You expect your spouse to be present and to love and to care about you. And that's how David taught me to think about God, that in the covenantal relationship with God, like a marriage, God is there to be a presence to inspire us, to call us to responsibility, to care and to love us, but not necessarily to solve all of our problems. And this metaphor was also meaningful for me because a big part of my experience here at the Hartman Institute was studying with my own husband. And my husband, who's also a rabbi and who was also in the rabbinic fellowship program with me. Many people assume that if two rabbis are married to each other, they spend all their time at home studying Torah, but I can tell you that doesn't often happen, the luxury of time at home, and to have 3 years here in this Beit Midrash with my husband, to be able to study Torah and to have found a rabbi who spoke to both of our souls so deeply was a very huge blessing in my life. And finally, just to conclude, I'll share one way that David Hartman deeply shaped my life was the way that he taught me to think about the role of a rabbi. David loved rabbis. He loved the gatherings of rabbis in the rabbinic seminars here and in the rabbinic fellowship programs because he deeply empathized with the experience of rabbis. He himself was a pulpit rabbi for 17 years in Montreal, and he understood that rabbis can often feel lonely, that it can sometimes be hard to live in a community in the role of teacher, preacher, counselor, leader, and not always have the space to be yourself. And so he created a place for rabbis to come where we could struggle and ask questions and wrestle with our doubts. And that was a huge blessing. And he modeled for us the importance of wrestling. He was always very open with his torments and with his pains and with his own spiritual wrestlings, and that was a really important role model, I think, for rabbis. He used to teach that smicha, rabbinic ordination, is an invitation to begin trying to understand what it means to live a life of faith in the world. In other words, once you become a rabbi and you're given ordination, you've just begun, and your whole life is a life of grappling and wrestling with faith. And the mistaken notion of rabbis who think that their role is to provide answers, David would drill into our heads over and over again every year. The role of a rabbi in America today is not to be an authority figure or a judge. What are missing are not answers. What are missing are questions. And a rabbi has to instill the desire to ask questions, to be troubled by Judaism. And that notion, that image of a rabbi has been my guiding framework since studying with David Hartman. And I sitting here, first of all, I'm just so honored to be on this panel with my teachers and now my colleagues. And I know that throughout my life that I will attempt to live up to the vision that David Hartman had for me and for all of us, to be bold, to be assertive, to be daring, but also to be deeply humble, and to keep asking questions and to know that there's never a final answer, that life is a continual struggle, and that we are called to continue to wrestle with our doubts, and there's no better place on earth than here at the Hartman Institute to wrestle with how to find meaning and relevance in Judaism today. Thank you.
Lauren, thank you. Thank you very much. Bernie.
I met David when, can you hear me now? I met David when we were both in transitions during our life. He was moving from the rabbinate to Jerusalem here, officially trying Aliyah out, a visiting professor at Hebrew U. Of course, you know, he stayed here and became professor emeritus at Hebrew University. I was here for a year to begin an academic career, but basically to go back to the States. So I first met David in the first class he gave at the Hebrew University, which was on the Rambam, Maimonides. And my field of specialty and what I was interested in was modern Jewish thought. And frankly, the only reason I took that class was really twofold bad reasons. One is I felt any graduate student, anyone in Jewish studies, at some point needed to study Maimonides. And even though I was a modern, I should study it. And the other is that I was in the graduate program in Hebrew U. All my classes were in Hebrew, and that was wonderful. Frankly, though, it was tiring. David, because he was a visiting professor, taught a full graduate course in English. I thought, great, I can let my head breathe a little bit. And the Rambam, oh, well, I need to learn it. Now, the Rambam, to me, I came in with a lot of negative baggage. The Rambam, to me, was, first and foremost, a dour image on a blue notebook. I don't know how many of you encountered that in Hebrew school, in Sunday school. The notebooks that were passed out that basically had a man with a turban, a beard, scowling at you. And I had a negative experience in Hebrew school anyway, and that sort of symbolized all that baggage. And then the other association I had with Maimonides was the secondary source books that I had read just as a graduate student, history of medieval philosophy, Yuzic, philosophies of Judaism, and I found the chapters on Maimonides totally unintelligible, abstractions, and uninviting. So I came in with this negative baggage, but I had reasons to be there. I walk into this class, a man named David Hartman. What does he look like? I don't know, because as I walked into this class, his head is down, just like this. And the room fills up, and for 5 minutes after the class is supposed to begin, he's, I don't know what, ruminating, deliberating, and then he raises his head, stands up, tall man, and as Lauren said, would teach with just extraordinary sense of energy, drama, moved, could not. I was sitting in the front row with my wife. He would spit. And I remember when we walked out of that class, she said, well, that class really is transformative. I mean, we've got to come back to this. I mean, this is amazing. And let's not sit in the front row again.
Bring an umbrella.
Yeah, or bring an umbrella. But basically, to make a long story short, I remember to this day the very first text I learned from David from the Rambam, which was on love and awe of God. And basically that went into my soul and mind so deeply that that class itself literally changed my life. And that single class, but then of course taking that class the whole semester. Well, what are some of the lessons I learned from that initial class that transformed my thinking, which then transformed my life? First of all, that intellectual rigor and emotional passion are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they're necessary components of what religious consciousness and what thought is. Intellectual rigor and emotional passion. And of course, David embodied that. I mean, you've heard that, Lauren mentioned it. The guy was uncompromising in his intellectual rigor, intellectual honesty, and equally profoundly passionate person. And the juxtaposition of those he embodied, and that was something that was incredibly liberating for me and also inspiring. His passion also was something that he felt needed to be translated into life, and the celebration of life was very much part of what it meant to be a learner and a liver at the same time. And I remember he invited his students to attend that very first year a Purim Suda, Purim meal at his house, which he had annually. And I had never been. You know, I went to college and was sort of a frat boy for a while. And, you know, I knew what a wild party looked like. Nothing like David Hartman's Suda Purim. It was just amazing. The singing, the wild dancing. And because it's a mitzvah and a religious obligation, a lot of booze. And David really loved scotch. Chivas Regal used to make kiddush on it every Yom Shabbat. That was also something that I picked up. But in that, but no one danced with more rigor than David. And I noticed, though, about halfway through, I don't know, maybe an hour into this, that he wasn't in the room. And you would notice that because he was literally bouncing. And I kind of looked and I saw a door ajar. It was a door to his bedroom when I went in there, and he was writhing in pain. Daniil had mentioned earlier that he had broken his back a few years earlier. And I went in there and I said, and I did call him Rabbi Hartman then, Rabbi Hartman, you know, what's the matter? And he looked at me and he said, well, it's okay. I need a rest. I need a rest. 5 minutes later, he was out dancing again. And what I realized was that over the years of spending almost every single day with him for 8 years, because I was the only one in our circle that had a car, so I was his driver. So I literally attended every single and drove him back and forth to every single class for 8 years that he taught. And I learned that he was in a state of chronic pain, chronic physical pain. And that was the only time I saw it. I mean, that or you could physically see it. He was a real affirmer of life to that extent. He changed my life in another way, though. I could go on and on with the ideas, but in a very practical way. I was on an academic trajectory, and it was very clear to me after learning with David Hartman that it was really critical for me to basically move out of the academy and to be a Jewish educator, to move into the community. That's what Torah was about. Torah was something that its value was in community. It was the legacy, the gift of the Jewish people, and if you were going to learn it and if you were going to be a teacher, you really had to do it out there. It was important at the same time for me to complete a PhD because he insisted the intellectual rigor, but the intellectual rigor for the sake of the Jewish people and the community. And the attitude of never, ever looking down or patronizing the community, that was something that I internalized in a very deep way. That the split between intellectual rigor, that's for an elite group of intellectuals to have a conversation between themselves, to write and teach to people whose interests are basically a closed insular circle, that was something really to him that was offensive about that. He had a profoundly ambivalent attitude towards the academy. On the other hand, to achieve and nurture intellectual excellence was something that I, as an individual, was expected to do, and in order to bring that to the community. And so I changed my career trajectory. I finished the doctorate, but it was clear from the day before I wrote the first sentence of my PhD that this was not going to end up in the academy, that it was going to somehow or other, in an open-ended way, be out in the community. And the last point I want to make about David in terms of what really has been transformational over the years, if you're going to be in the community as an educator, it's your role to shape the community and not simply reflect the community. That what's really important is to basically set a standard and move the community, elevate the community, move them forward. Don't simply be some sort of intellectual bureaucrat. And that came from a very deep teaching of his, which appears throughout his writings, which has to do with the role of vision and the role of hope and the role of imagination. He gets that from Maimonides. By the way, the Rambam that I learned from David Hartman wasn't cold, a very warm, and also like Halevi, a Rambam who basically elevated the role of the imagination, right, the prophet. And so that's important because hope is self-fulfilling and cynicism is self-destructive. And so this story, and I'll end on this, basically kind of summarizes how I first really internalized that thought, not intellectually, but in my very, very being. In the second year, when I met David Hartman, he had this idea about the Machon. And he had talked about the Machon from not the first day I met him, but when I got to know him outside of the class situation. He had a vision of the Machon, and he would talk about it. And outside of the university classes, we would meet every Friday in his home, and we'd learn together. A small group of people. And one day he says to me, Bernie, there's I won't mention a name, but there's a so-and-so, and he mentioned this person by name as if I knew this person. Shmuley is coming from Montreal. He's going to be at the airport. Would you please pick him up and show him around the Machon? And what? Show him around the Machon. Now, the Machon did not exist. The Machon did not exist, I promise you. And so when I sit here, in this room, you have no idea. When I go back to this conversation, the Machon did not exist. And so I said, Rabbi Hartman, What do you mean? What Machon? And he says, he's going to be here in an hour and a half, and you'll see him by da-da-da-da. Here's what he looks like. You'll figure it out. And, and I figured it out. I picked him up, and I showed him around the Machon. I showed him around the Machon. The Machon was the learning and the conversations that we had in my car all those times, in his classrooms, and in his home. And I told him about those conversations, what we were learning, engaged him in conversations. And what I realized was a couple of things. One is the Machon is a conversation. It's a certain kind of conversation. But secondly, I learned that if you're going to be an educator, an educational leader, and you're going to shape the community and not simply reflect it, you have to basically live with the gap between the reality in front of you and the aspiration and vision that you want to create, and you better make it happen. And David made it happen beyond anything that any of us could have imagined. In the early days when he would articulate these visions, I used to think, boy, I'm getting pulled into this. I got to go back to my dad again, a businessman, very tactless guy, and say, Dad, I need another year in Israel. I came for a year. I stayed 13 years. My children were born here. My daughter's here tonight. A product of David Hartman, intellectually and spiritually very much. And so I think I'll end with that.
Thank you, Bernie. Thank you, Yisra.
My story goes some years after Bernie, because when I came first to the Institute, I believe it was 79, Bernie was there, and this is where we met. When I came to study at the Institute, I was a doctoral student in the Department of Talmud at the Hebrew University. If you have seen the movie Footnote, this movie is about my teachers. If you remember the older guys, there was one, the father who was named Eliezer. He was my first teacher. I worked as a research assistant with him. And then there was the bad guy, his name was in the movie Grossman, and he was, I wrote my dissertation under him. Okay? So, and well, both of them were really great scholars. They knew a lot. But their focus, like in the movie, was on manuscripts, having the right version of the Talmud, reading different dialects of Aramaic. All this was very important for them. And they were masters, great masters, both of them. But I felt something is missing, because for me, there were questions about the Talmud, about the Mishnah, what was the religious thought within the Talmud, what was the theology of the rabbis. But we were not allowed to ask these questions in the Talmud department. They told us, well, we don't know the right version, so we have to first create collect all the manuscripts and see what is the correct version. And then we will be able to ask this question. So I asked Eliezer, I asked him, when we will have the right version and we will be able to ask theological issues, say, maybe 200 or 300 years. So, okay, medicine is developing, but I don't know if I will be able to be alive till this time. So I was really frustrated. And this is why I came to the Shalom Hartman Institute. And I sat there for 2 years, and it was in a conflict, because the university, the Talmud department of the university was on the one hand, and then David, as you said, he was a very religious person, always obsessed with religious theological questions, arguments with God, morality, all these issues always were vital for him. And there was a big and sharp difference. At the end, I took 1 year of a leave from my doctorate, and I devoted the whole of this year to the studies in the institute. And this year we studied the tractate Brachot, which is the first tractate of the Talmud, and it is devoted to the study of the issues of prayer and the Shema, reciting the Shema. And I gave a class on the meaning of the religious meaning of the Shema. And David was very much impressed by it. And then he came to me and he said, look, I see that there is some poetry within you, imagination, vitality. These people in the university, they will kill it. They will dry you. I don't want you to go back there. I'm serious, he said. I want you to quit. I was already teaching at the Talmud department. To quit your job at the Hebrew University. I will give you a room. We were in the old building in Rachel Imenu 28. No, not many rooms, but I will give you a room. I will buy you a library, and I will give you a fellowship that you will be able to sit there and study. And you will not be bothered by them, because this is a dangerous place for you. And I hesitated. You know, I was in the middle of a dissertation. I had a job, and this man comes and tells me, quit everything. But he was so enthusiastic that he convinced me. And I quitted my job. I stopped writing this dissertation, and I went, the small rooms that he created for me with the books, and I started learning there. And what happened that during this year, after I left the Talmud department, I became interested in the study of Tanakh, which I never studied in the university. And I had some ideas about biblical studies and theology. And then I met the late Professor Moshe Greenberg, who was a great scholar of Bible. And he was interested in both, in philology, in manuscript, but also in theological issues. So I stopped my connection with the Talmud department in the university. I enrolled to writing a dissertation in Bible. And there, I felt very good having David Hartman on the one hand and Moshe Greenberg on the other hand. This was wonderful for me. And I felt new vitality with me. And it changed my career, because I'm a professor of Bible now for many years in the Hebrew University and here. And all of this came from that conversation with David Hartman. And I think that I was not the only one who enjoyed this attention and generosity from David Hartman. Whenever he felt that there is a person here in those years who needs some help, direction, that he can help him building a new way, opening new way. He did everything he could in order to allow him to do it, to give him the space, to give him the time. And for him, it was always very, very clear that the academic life should not be detached from the community. He did it himself, and this is how he educated me. That, you always have to try to share your ideas with the Jewish people, to write books which can be read by wider circles, not just for the academic world, to teach rabbis, to teach lay leaders. All this that we do now for 30 years in the Institute, this was the message that we get from him. And I'm sure that if I wouldn't meet him, I would be like one of those professors in footnotes. No other chance.
No, you wouldn't.
The good guy, not the bad guy. So I think we were blessed that this person came here to Jerusalem. I think to myself, I mean, wouldn't he come? I mean, my life were absolutely different. His arrival here in Jerusalem was like a miracle for us. And all these years, he was so dedicated to his goal, to his mission, to bring together people, to teach them Torah. He was, for us, a great example for our life.
Thank you, Yisrael. Let's open for questions to the panel, and I'd also like to invite people to share with us briefly any memories, recollections that you may have about David, how David affected you in your life. And again, please, I emphasize to be brief so we can allow others to speak. And when you do speak, first, please tell us who you are and where you're from. It's like David Hartman asking a class for questions. Yes.
He talked about, and this was he talked about making Aliyah, and he thought that coming here to Israel, that when it would be Pesach, that instead of talking about what is kosher and what's not kosher in the market, that this would be a place where people would be debating all the issues that have to do with remembering the time of Mitzrayim. And of course, he was very disappointed when that didn't happen. But what he did say is that for him, one of the greatest privileges was to teach the commanders in the Israeli forces. Because for him, that's where the theory of what was going on out in the real world came into practice. Because as many of you know, a lot of the commanders come here and they're taught Jewish values and Jewish ethics. And then it's not theory anymore. Then it's, what do you do when someone comes across the border and it's an ambulance, and what do Jewish values and ethics say about whether you stop this person and that person? And he just created such excitement and joy to hear that. And just to briefly end this remark, I felt very good about that because on this last Yom HaZikaron, I know that there's, and correct me if I'm wrong, I know there's a tradition in the IDF where the head of the IDF, Benny Johnson, goes to the grave site of the last soldier who has passed away in the fighting over the last year, and to place a flag on the grave site of that soldier. And it happened this year. However, what happened was that the soldier who died wasn't actually the last soldier who had passed away. It was another soldier who, for whatever reasons, the rabbinate had ruled was not Jewish, and so was in a different part of the cemetery. And the family of the soldier who had passed away and who had been given the flag said, we can't accept this flag because the person who died actually for this country is buried over here. This family should have the flag. And as I read that story, I just thought about Rabbi Hartman. Because that's really, and he said this many times, to be a Jew, if you're willing to die for this country, that's my definition of Judaism. And I wish he would have been alive to hear that story played out in the actual, real, living life of Eretz Israel.
Thank you. I think David Zionism came from this profound appreciation for Israel's empowerment of the Jewish people and of Judaism. And to use a metaphor that David might have invoked, the Jewish people was now at bat. And we were now responsible for our fate. We were responsible for the nature of Judaism in the public space. And David was profoundly anguished, more and more in his later years, about the state of official Judaism in this country, and really would cry out and say, is Judaism going to make it? Does it have a future? And there was no division between David Hartman, the individual, and David Hartman, the Jew, and the sense of deep personal responsibility that he felt for the future of the Jewish people, of Israel, of Judaism, was simply overwhelming. So thank you. Does anyone want to add about David's relationship to Israel, to Zionism? Please.
When the Machon in the early years actually came into existence, where there was a physical site, and he set up the first Beit Midrash, the way he structured the program was you'd learn every morning from 8 to 1, but in the afternoon you had an obligation to go out into the community and teach. And Sahal was one of the first venues that he basically sent people out to teach in the bases.
In the IDF.
In the IDF.
Thank you. Yes. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Jerry Zolden. I first met David 5 years ago on my first trip to community leadership stuff. And I want to pick up on something Norma said about big and small. Before I came, I wanted to have a sense of who David Hartman was, and I read 3 of his books before I got here. And as he was leaving, during one of our breaks, I was able to walk with him. And I started talking to him, and I taught him to introduce myself by saying, you know, Rabbi, I read your books. And he stopped and turned towards me, put his arm on my shoulder and said, oh, you read my books. I was in a position there of trying to be humble in the face of a charismatic leader, and he, in an instant, made me feel so good about myself, and made himself available to me, and took himself off the pedestal that I was, trying to put him on. And that was my biggest impression of David, and it stayed with me every time we would talk and every time we would encounter each other. And other years you would ask, are you sad that you read those books? Because what he was saying is, I've grown. That was then. I'm now. You can't be there either. And it's a challenge to be associated with the home. And it's a pleasure too.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Shalom from Canada. I'm just wondering how, I haven't met David Hartman, I don't know anything about him personally really, just read some of his books. How did he relate with Soloveitchik after David Hartman formed his own philosophical outlook that was so radically different from Soloveitchik? Did he continue a relationship, or did he break away totally?
I don't know if it was really possible to continue a relationship with your mentor once you repudiate him, although the repudiation, I think, came later after Soloveitchik passed on. And it made it in some ways more poignant and perhaps painful for David to repudiate his late mentor, and to do so quite sharply. I mean, I hope you will read The God Who Hates Lies, because what he says there is that the reverence that he felt for Soloveitchik was completely misplaced. And again, bear in mind that he was a scholar of Soloveitchik. He built his early reputation on being being the interpreter, really, of Soloveitchik. So that sense of retroactive repudiation was very much in character with a kind of intellectual ferocity that I think you heard among the panelists here. He was relentless and unforgiving in the search for truth, and no one would stand in his way, including himself, including his own most cherished ideas.
Yeah, I just want to add a PS to that. The first class that was taught on Soloveitchik in the Hebrew University was probably the class you were in, on the William Manifest. I was in that class as well. And in that class, he was also critical of Soloveitchik. Not to the extent of repudiation, but he was critical on several points. And he did maintain a face-to-face relationship with Soloveitchik on those issues. And the second point I want to make about this is that one of the things that he credited Soloveitchik of giving him was relentless intellectual honesty. I mean, he would tell stories over and over again about Soloveitchik was uncompromisingly intellectually honest. So even at the end of his intellectual career, where he wrote the article and it did repudiate the philosophy of Soloveitchik, as you rightly said, yes, he also would have felt that he was doing it on the basis of a value that he actually attributed to Soloveitchik.
Thank you.
Repudiation of Soloveitchik and a lot of the other sharp words he has in God Who Hates Lies for other thinkers and other traditions fits with the main theme of his book, A Heart of Many Rooms, and the reflection of change, or it fits together somehow.
Lauren, why don't you take that?
It's a good question. The question was how does his very critical positions, especially in his last book, against other thinkers, align with his theology of religious pluralism? I think in some ways they go hand in hand, because he was always extremely critical of others and critical of himself. And because he had this deep notion of human limitation and that no one human can possess all of the truth, then every person is both partially right and partially wrong. And he saw it as a crusade, and it was part of his kind of intellectual honesty that where he saw others wrong, that he would point it out. And so I don't think there's an inconsistency there. I actually think throughout all of his writings you see sharp criticisms of every thinker, even thinkers that he, like Maimonides, that he was deeply devoted to, and Soloveitchik and others. But he loved argument, and he celebrated, he thought that the spirit, that the Talmud was really the foundation for the modern spirit of pluralism. And in the Talmud you have rabbis who sharply disagree and argue, and he loved the Talmud, and he taught Talmud in almost every class, because I think that modeled the kind of dialectics in Judaism that he celebrated and he wanted to perpetuate.
About his honesty and self-critique, I would like to share with you an experience that we had in his last appearance here in the Institute. We celebrated his birthday, 80th birthday, and there was gathering of the veterans of the Institute in the evening, and later on the other day, here we sat here, and all the teachers of the high school and the scholars of the Institute, all of them came to listen to him. And what he said in both occasions, in the evening with the veterans and the other day with all the community, was, I made a bad mistake in all my writing. I didn't consider the significance of the Holocaust in a right way. I didn't struggle with the religious questions which are connected with the Holocaust in a serious way. This is a bad mistake that I did, and I regret it deeply. And I saw to myself, a person in his age, his health was not good, already there. And he has this, ability and braveness to come and say, I did something very wrong in all my books, in all my writings. He even he said, you should turn them, because I did not commit my mission to deal with this terrible issue in modern Jewish history. I didn't give enough attention to it. It is something which is deeply missing in all my writings. So, this was for me amazing. Amazing. The urge for truth, for self-critique, even in this stage of his life. I met him later on a private meeting, but this was his last talk here to the community of the Institute. And I see it in a way as his legacy, because this is a legacy of, constantly asking questions, criticizing others, and as you said, criticizing yourself, and seeking for religious truth without fear. This is his legacy for me.
Thank you. I think the love and the gratitude that you've heard expressed here tonight is so powerful that I feel a David's presence. I feel almost that we should be speaking of David in the present tense. And the lasting impact that he's had in our individual lives, in our collective being, in all of you here, is so profound that one can really only end by saying, may his memory be a blessing for us all. Yehi zichro baruch. Thank you very much.